I've had just a wonderful sort of vacation day away from work. I know I'm still getting paid by NCSC to be here, but this isn't work. This is what I call fun. I like to think of myself as a big thinker, and this conference is the biggest thinking conference that I think I've ever participated in. It's very hard to get our hands around the whole subject matter, but I think there really is something there to get a hold of that's exciting and is something that really grasps where the world is and where the world is going to. We're at our fourth session. Just to recap what Adil said in the morning, session one was what are these transformations? The second one was how do they happen? And three, what drives them? Now we're going to look at what transformations in the making. Throughout the session so far, though, it's been very general. And the reason for that is it's very hard to nail down a lot of precise grasp behind these issues. But I'm not concerned too much. I want to pick a quote from Alan Greenspan that I thought really I use a lot these days. He was talking about, I think, the inflation index or what came behind it. And he said, it's much better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. And we are in a subject where it is not possible to be precise that, this is how it works. However, if we think carefully about what's going on, I think we can be approximately right about many of the things that are happening, and maybe approximately right, if we're lucky, about some of the things that ought to happen, some of the levers that ought to be pressed in order to make transformations occur. And I was just talking to Paul about his slide this morning about proximate drivers and ultimate drivers, and in my mind, feeling that there is no one driver. There are maybe a set of drivers that all have to work together. And if you don't have all of them working in tandem, then transformations don't occur. In this session, we're going to go from very big picture to very focused local example. The first talk is going to come from Barry Hughes, and the second one, Iqbal Kadir. Barry's talk is going to be really looking at the world and trying to encapsulate the big picture, and Iqbal is going to sort of give us the real focus down on the ground illustration of that. So to introduce Barry, I had his bio here. Barry is from University of Denver, the Graduate School of International Studies. His principal research interests, I think, tell us exactly why we're here today and what this is all about. One, world politics. Two, computer simulation models for economic, energy, food, population, environmental, and socio-political forecasting. Three, policy analysis. And four, global futures. And if that doesn't summarize exactly what this is all about, I don't know what does. So Barry, on that note, you're going to have the pinnacle now of elucidating and illuminating everything we've been doing.
Thanks, Peter. I think what you just read suggests that I've never been able to figure out what I really wanted to do. And so here I am, still struggling with that. The effort that I'm going to try to make today cuts across to some degree what we've been talking about, but also focuses on a very large part, so focus is maybe not the right word. When I was thinking about this conference, I was thinking about the sustainability transformation, to which I'll come back and try to give a little bit more concrete definition. But I was thinking about the elements of it in much the same way that probably that the co-chairs were thinking about the agenda today. And I made a list of what I said were key elements for facilitating a sustainability transition. Now that I'm here in the School of Management, I've decided to rename this the value chain for those of us in the sustainability transformation business. And these are the elements of the value chain to which we all try to add something. The first element of the value chain is defining the condition of the human condition. Some of us focus on developing measures, developing data, presenting that, developing indices, making those available, like Sakita last night and the Human Development Index. I think we all sometimes forget that a lot of our knowledge in this area is fairly contemporary. GDP only goes back to the 1930s, HDI in the last 20 years, so it is fairly recent that we've had some of the knowledge that we have of the human condition, and there's a lot of value to be added there. Another area is, in this value chain, is increasingly clear goals, scenario visioning of the future, the kind of thing that Paul does exceptionally well, Millennium Development Goals, making that more specific. Another area I think of on the value chain, another link on the value chain, is understanding the dynamics of the systems upon which we are working, the elements of this integrated global system, which has so many geographic and temporal and cross-issue linkages. And that is, to some degree, where integrated modeling, among other efforts, among other activities, tries to add some value, and it's the area that I'm going to be talking about primarily today. A related link in the value chain is specific evaluation of levers for action. And you've heard me at a couple of points during the conference already ask people about what might be the key levers, what might be the most important things we can pull to give us impetus in the direction we want to go. And that's another area that I'm trying in my work, and also the work with the Pardee Center at RAND and Jim Doerr to investigate. Then another link in the value chain is obviously taking all of these things to the socio-political environment, engaging a broader public, NGOs, INGOs, all the rest of the actors, state actors, in the debates that are so important in making some of this happen. All of us work at different levels of this value chain in this room, I would argue, in this business of sustainability transformation. I'm going to be focusing primarily on links 3 and 4 and talking about talking about using an integrated model to try to investigate leverage that we have. In order to do that, I can't ignore the other links of the value chain. The integrated modeling system that I've tried to put together, something called International Futures, also has to have a substantial amount of information about the human condition, a substantial database. It also has to be very sensitive to the kinds of scenarios that we can develop and goals that we have for the world, and try to integrate those in some meaningful way into the analysis. So I'm not ignoring the other links in the value chain, but I'm going to focus just a little bit as I try to figure out what I'm doing in my life. By the way, I should say that part that I am focusing on, this integrated global modeling, is not exactly a small part. This attempt to understand dynamics of these systems is something I've been working on now for a large number of years, as many of you have, and attempting to build an integrated global computer simulation is a pretty time-demanding activity. I often ask myself why I'm spending so much time doing this. Then I turn around and say, well, I don't play golf. I've got some time on my hands. What else would I be doing here? I might as well spend a little more time on this. The linkage just before the integrated modeling. Scenarios of the global future. I've been struggling with this probably not as successfully as Paul and some of the others have, but I've gone through a bit of a process in trying to think about scenarios and how they should frame my investigation of leverage. And I started out, I'm not completely ending up here, but I started out thinking in terms of two sets of dimensions for the scenarios that we develop around global futures. One set, and I'll elaborate this in just a minute, is a set of understandings of the environment and technology. I'm referring to that as a mostly contextual scenarioization, if that's a word, of the world. That is to say, we have some leverage with respect to understanding of the environment, the degree of fragility or robustness in the environment. But that to some considerable degree, fragility or robustness of the environment is something we have to take as a given. It's a context for our human agency or interaction. To some degree, that's also true of technological advance. We struggle to accelerate technological advance, but to a considerable degree, the technological advance with respect to use of energy per dollar of GDP remains this thing over which we have limited control. On the other hand, there is a substantial range of human agency through action and interaction of humans, over which we have a substantial amount of control, and that structures a different set of dimensions around scenarios. And let me elaborate this just a little bit more. Around the contextual scenarios, and energy on the environment and technology. This is in some ways where much of the scenario discussion around sustainability transformations began, back with limits to growth and the more Malthusian perspectives, the more technologically optimistic perspectives. I just rough out something here which is always questionable in terms of the way these two dimensions frame a scenario space, but in general, an awful lot of the efforts over the last 30 years have thought of the world in one of two quadrants, upper right or the lower left. The lower left being one that I sometimes have called neo-traditionalist, a strange expression perhaps, but kind of Malthusian or eco-holist. That limits to growth fits there, possibly the barbarization scenario to some degree fits there. Modernism as the other extreme, Julian Simon with the ultimate resource. To some degree, the conventional worlds fits up there. Again, this is a rough conceptualization that I'm not going to hold to. I'm going to try to suggest a way of moving beyond it, in fact. But it's where we've come from, I think, in thinking about these scenario spaces. Human agency scenarios is another way of organizing this space. Organization and cooperation. I've put down here again two dimensions. One dimension has over on the right here market-driven world. The other one has an institutionally state actors, international actors, or other agency-led kind of actions and interaction patterns. Another dimension is between primarily competitive or somewhat more conflictual patterns of interaction and more cooperative patterns of interaction. And I'm not going to go into any detail on these, but in general, these dimensions help frame some of the traditional perspectives with respect to thinking about the future, including to some degree, although I think it's a little bit crude, some of the scenarios that Paul has put forward. For instance, I think that the fortress world scenario is characterized in substantial part by agencies acting on their own behalf, whether it's states or businesses in a largely competitive or conflictual world, trying to protect their interests. As opposed to the globalization world, which is primarily market-driven, without so much of that intervention. Still, there's a lot of competition, obviously, so market forces are at work here. Now, as I say, I went through and still feels that there's some value in this kind of activity, but as I went through it, and I came to trying to figure out how to represent this in a computer simulation, I came to a slightly different structure here for developing and inputting scenarios, which I want to talk to you a little bit about. Inside this international futures simulation, which, by the way, has been constructed over a period of 20-odd years, and which a version of which is available for download on the web, anybody who wants it. In constructing this, I have, over the last couple, 3 years, developed what I call a scenario tree, which allows us to put together blocks of assumptions and interventions in fairly flexible ways, more flexible ways than those dimensional spaces allow us to do, and allow us to build up a fairly, an almost infinite range of scenarios. And I'll tell you how I am trying to use this. On this scenario tree, and this is going to be a little bit confusing, so maybe I better take a bit of time to explain it. On this scenario tree are different categories of issue area, and under these, when we click on these in this scenario tree, it brings up assumptions that we can change within the model, parameters that we can set, interventions that we can change. The top two categories here are technological change and environmental uncertainties, corresponding more or less to that first set of contextual dimensions. So a person can go in here and basically, by selecting under these categories, particular settings, come up with either the limits to growth or the technological enthusiast scenario, or some variations thereof. Selection across these categories gives us a very considerable flexibility around that particular scenario space. The same thing is true down here in the agency categories. Households or individuals, government or social political actors, firms and businesses. I'm going to be adding a dimension we're building now on intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations. Let me give you an example of how this sort of thing works. For instance, here I have loaded into this tree some interventions in the model with respect to HIV and AIDS. There's been a fairly recent study done by the Directorate of Intelligence, was picked up by Eberstadt and published in Foreign Affairs, suggesting that India, China, and Russia have, to some considerable degree, underestimated the prevalence of HIV/AIDS and the rapidity of its spread. Here I have a scenario block which I can read into this tree, which allows me to change the base case or baseline assumptions with respect to HIV prevalence and spread, and do a different run of the model with that different set of assumptions. Under these scenario files on this menu option here, I can and have put together multiple blocks that correspond more or less to those spaces I was talking about before. One space being limits to growth, another space being technological enthusiasm. There can be different combinations of blocks with respect to energy, with respect to agriculture, with respect to demography. I'm already risking getting more technical than I want in this area. But what I'm trying to say is that an investigative model like this, it's looking at the dynamics of human systems, has to have some framing assumptions. I can't just put forward one scenario about the world. I have to put forward some framing assumptions and then ask what leverage we have with respect to those framing assumptions. This is a tool that allows me and users of this model to do that. Now, what's the model that lies underneath this tool? The model that is there has several sub-models or representations. It has representations of technological change, of environmental resources and quality, food, energy submodels, population, economic submodels, socio-political and international political representations, and linkages among these. This is a model that's been evolving over a period of 20-odd years, and many of these representations are really fairly far advanced. Others, like the energy model, I'm afraid to say, Cutler, are not so terribly advanced. Exactly. But let me tell you a little bit. I mean, in the demographic model, John, I don't see you out there. Are you still here? Oh, okay, right there in front of me. The demographic model here is a cohort component representation with age, sex structures broken down in the normal cohort component ways, with fertility and mortality representations by age category. And also it draws on the most recent UN population revision. The 2002 population revision has representation of migration patterns. It has a representation of HIV/AIDS prevalence. So it's a fairly sophisticated population model. In fact, in terms of ones that are readily available for use by people, since you can download this from the web, it's probably about as good as you can get. Most of the UN and Census Bureau kinds of things are not so publicly available. The economic representation is when I put this presentation together, I didn't realize I was going to be quite so model and technically oriented. I don't mean to be. I want to get into the substance of this. But the economic model is a multi-sector general equilibrium model. So it has representation of market equilibration processes, but it also has representation of what have come to be known as social flows or social accounting structures. That is to say, we keep track of how much the government spends on different things, on education, on health, on the military. And we can change our assumptions about how much the government spends on those things and where those flows go to different social actors. How much of them go? How much of government spending goes to subsidies for firms? How much of it goes to transfer payments for pensions or social payments or spending on education that benefit households? The kinds of structures that are in that economic representation are more or less what Richard Stone helped develop a number of years ago with the system of national accounts. It uses some of the most uses extensively World Bank data and United Nations data to populate it, and it therefore has a fairly significant representation of the kinds of systems that are out there in terms of both the market and in terms of social exchange and social flows. And I could go through and talk about some of these other components, some of which are not developed as well as these. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I want to stress that in terms of this link in the value chain, in terms of trying to translate our goals, our desires for achieving a more sustainable world into an analysis of the levers for action that might give us the most purchase. I think it's important to think in terms of structure and agency. Structures like I've just been talking about, demographic structures. People move through demographic systems. But there is agency involved also. Households make decisions with respect to fertility rates. How many children are we going to have? And those decisions, that agency has changed over time. With respect to economics, there are structures. There are production and consumption, exchange structures, but there is also agency. There's agency with respect to how, again, the governmental intervention, firm practices, household consumption patterns. One of the most important things, I think, again, coming out of Paul's sustainability scenario is the possibility that value systems could change and households could consume in very different ways. We have to be able to represent that kind of agency along with the structures, and that's what we're trying to do here. Now, in terms of not the tool, but in terms of the use of the tool now, moving towards the use of it. I've been involved for the last 3 years now with a project sponsored by the European Commission called TERRA. TERRA has been administered by RAND in Europe, actually, and has brought together a number of teams from around Europe in a variety of countries. In fact, it's been discouraging sometimes. The European Commission, when it sets up a project, has to have geographic distribution of the public good here in terms of the resources that are available for research and analysis. And in the process of putting together a large team, you get put together in a hodgepodge sometimes of motivations and capabilities, but on the whole, it's been a productive exercise. I think we've been able to draw together a lot of different streams of insight into thinking about sustainability. One of the things the TERRA project did fairly near the beginning was to define sustainability in terms of 3 major dimensions. The human condition, sometimes expressed in terms of human capital, growth and equity, and environmental quality. And this was important for me to have conceptually. Often in this country, when we talk about sustainability, we think about environmental elements. As almost everybody in this room would understand, sustainability means much more. It means advancing human condition, achieving growth with equity, and improving the environmental quality, protecting the environmental quality. What we did in this project in connection with that is we went through and we identified a number of levers of action to try to enhance the human condition, to try to achieve growth with equity, to try to protect or enhance global sustainability. We identified a number of leverage points that we could examine in the context of this computer simulation or other tools in the project. Increased expenditures on research and development, enhanced diffusion of electronic networking, greater spending on formal education, and we tried to identify amounts of intervention that were in some way in keeping with some of the goals that have been set or expressed by national governments or by international organizations or other agents. We did that with respect to human capital. We did that with respect to growth and equity. We did that with respect to environmental quality. Then we started introducing those levers individually and collectively in patterns to see how much leverage they might have in this integrated system as represented by the computer simulation. And with full knowledge that a computer simulation like this is a flawed representation of reality, but at the same time is a thinking tool, a workbench for trying to sort out where you might have the most leverage. The IFs Base Case I'm not going to discuss in any detail, but the point of the IFs Base Case is you have to start this leverage someplace. The idea being after you look at the base case, then you look at a more ecologically or environmentally unfriendly case, you look at a more technologically optimistic case, and you test the robustness of your interventions. You test the degree to which your intervention package might work in other contextual scenarios also. The suggestion of this analysis is that we have considerable leverage with different, and I'm not going to go into the relative leverage of each intervention point, although that's part of the reason for doing this. I'm just going to suggest overall we can achieve a great deal more on something like the HDI, the bottom line being the base case, the top line being what we call the sustainability scenario, a package of intervention levers. We can achieve quite a bit more in terms of economic growth, and at the same time also enhance equity. The point about the world being a third world country is exactly right. If you look at the GDP now, the Lorenz curve and the Gini for the GDP, you have a situation where the bottom 90% of the world's population gets something like 15% of the GDP. The Gini index is 0.75, which, as you pointed out, is off the scale even for Brazil, which I think is what, 0.556, something in there? Yeah. So the world is a very poor Brazil, or very unequally distributed Brazil in that sense. But in the sustainability scenario, we were able to achieve not a great world, but at least something as good as, or maybe a little better than Brazil, through the package of interventions, particularly the ones focused on human capital development, actually, education and so on. We're also able to shift somewhat, bend the curve a little bit with respect to the development of democratization processes in the world. We're also able to bend the curve, although it was already bending in the base case, in this particular case, this particular analysis with respect to deforestation and rebuild some forest after the middle of the century. We were able to slightly bend the curve with respect to environmental quality as measured by carbon dioxide accumulation in the atmosphere, but not, even with our most significant package of levers, not able to slow down or not able to stop that accretion of carbon dioxide until near the end of the century. Overall, here's my kind of set of general conclusions. First, I do think that these elements in the value chain, which we haven't talked so much about in here today, are important ones. We need to understand the human condition. We need to envision superior futures, but we also need to investigate the dynamics of the systems we're working on and the leverage of particular kinds of interventions. I think doing so is a contributing stream to the public debate, to the public analysis, and to the public desire, hopefully, to be able to achieve some of these things. Often I find that I would probably place this kind of analysis a little bit too much in the reform world, perhaps, not enough in the transformation world. But in reality, some of these interventions, such as the changes in patterns of consumption, also have some serious connection to the sustainability transformation. So it's someplace in between. I think value can be added here, and that's the part of the chain and in spite of the fact that I'll never learn golf, it's part of the chain that I will continue to work on for a while.
If I'm correct, Iqbal is still in transit from Logan Airport. Is that correct?
Correct.
So maybe what we should do is actually go to questions for Barry, and let's get into that discussion, and then we'll pick up Iqbal when he arrives.
Thank you. I thought those were nice additions. But on this carbon dioxide, you just immediately knew where I was going. Got the right chart there. It seems to me there's three major pathways that I assume you didn't take into account. One is massive carbon sequestration research and policy, which is a doable thing. It's a human agency variable. The second is the whole business of wireless transmission of Earth sources, as well as coupled with the solar satellite sources. And of course, the third is nuclear. Any one of those threes should have a dramatic effect on that curve, I would assume.
I think that is a good question. Cutler, do you want to answer it?
Well, I think that solar powered satellite is a net energy break even. Solar has not been proven, even with the Peter Glazer and all those guys, their newest technologies. It's a wash.
Have you been seeing the last 3 years of NSS research?
I've seen them, yeah, and I'm not
More
convinced at
workloads
all.
and stuff, the last
And the
few years?
sequestration thing, I mean, come on, we have no idea what that's going to cost.
No, the question-
Electricity
we
could be
haven't
15
done-
cents a kilowatt
We
hour.
haven't done the research.
Well,
There's about 20 streams on carbon sequestration that have not been pulled together in any chart or in any room that I know of on the Earth. The cost
we're
benefit
talking
time
decades
impact-
here before the
No, what I'm
climate
saying
starts to
is that
change. You know, you're talking about
What I'm saying is the
technologies.
carbon sequestration has not been assessed as a full spectrum. Not only just the coal stuff, that's just one of 20. Pulling together the whole sheet, what is the state of knowledge of this planet on carbon sequestration, has not been pulled together. Secondly, we haven't then assessed the science of all of them. Third, we haven't done the cross impact, the cost effect to time impact. And third, we haven't then taken the policy implications of the first two categories. Hasn't been done. That could be a decision, could be done within a year. The research on that could be done for over 10 years. Within that period of time, you could have a dramatic impact.
There's an underlying theme that maybe
There's
I
no
could...
major energy technology on the planet that's ever come online in a decade. Come on, you're talking about a major restructuring of the energy system to store gazillion tons of carbon, and it's not going to happen in a decade, and the policy decision isn't going to happen in a year. I mean, come on. These take decades to come online, and we don't know. You're right. We should explore, like we should explore other options. But you don't know at the end of it whether electricity is going to cost 15 cents a kilowatt hour, and then look what that does to macroeconomic growth.
The factors that are making the rates of change accelerate themselves are accelerating, and our assumptions about how fast things can be done, in my experience as a futurist over 30 years, have been lacking.
I have.
Wind energy technology didn't come online any faster than advances in steam. Steam turbines.
All right, how long do you think it would take to make a mechanical spider put in space? If we decided right now, let's put a mechanical spider in space, how long?
You're going to tell me, so why don't you go ahead and tell me?
I'd say conservatively, 10 years, conservatively. I mean, rationally, I think 5 years. Once you got the mechanical spider, then you're spitting out solar satellites, quite rapidly. To build up to that point is 5 to 10 years. Those are decisions. Those are human decisions.
There's an underlying issue, though, that is a challenge that cannot be captured by these models. And what you're pointing out is one. And the things that cannot be captured are, one, unpredictable technological, scientific breakthroughs. Tomorrow, somebody over at Princeton suddenly says, there's a big breakthrough in fusion, couldn't even conceive of it. Suddenly, something dramatic happens that completely transforms the situation. The other thing is an unpredicted catastrophe. Either it be a war, or you see the Gulf Stream suddenly switching, on the deep ocean current switches around because of climate change. The challenge with this type of approach to the future is that it is possible to make reasonable projections based on moderate trends. If we increase agricultural production at a certain predictable rate, or if we increase efficiency at a certain rate, what it is not possible are those world-changing, pivotal things. And I don't see any way that you could ever predict them in a model. Yet they do occur. But nobody, if I knew what they were, I'd be cashing in right now. One here and then here. So,
Actually,
microphone.
Paul, did you want to respond directly to that point? There's a two-finger rule for direct response.
Okay,
Let Paul do
one
that.
microphone here and one microphone at the back of the room.
Of course, I'll get mine. I mean, this is a fascinating debate. Probably we should continue offline because I can get a little technical about it. But there is a problem with the way we quantify things. Basically, it's what I call the Newtonian approach. You have initial conditions, you have a set of algorithms, you put in the parameters, and it marches forward over time. The problem, of course, is that limits the capacity to capture the part of the scenario narrative that's discontinuous, that surprises, that structural shifts. One way around that, at least that we've been doing, is to break the Newtonian approach by putting in not only the initial conditions, but a vision of the future, the final condition, year 2050, whatever it is. It's called a backcast. So instead of a forecast where you're sort of marching forward, you're anchoring the scenario quantification in two places, forward and backward. And then you ask a different question, not trying to march forward into the future, but is it feasible to get to that future? And in so doing, you can actually need to exogenously sometimes break the model and restart it under different conditions because we don't know how to write equations that where independent and dependent variables become redefined in the middle of the runs and so on and so forth. There's some research going on to try to do that, but it is a constraint of this kind of thing, and I think we need to think about how we can lend quantitative illumination to these scenarios, as I think you do is better than anyone, but yet try to get away from needing to commit to the structural continuity of the
Does
equation.
that give us the challenge of essentially the Far Side cartoon? That I don't know if you've seen it, the scientist is standing at a board with all these calculations, and in the middle of his calculations is this thing, it's a little bubble, and it says, a miracle happens or something happens, and his colleague says, well, I think you better explain that bit a little more closely. These things do occur, and history is replete full of things where things could not be predicted, a trigger happened, and the course of the future was changed by it. But nobody can know when they're going to occur, how they're going to impact. That's the real challenge. But the approach you described, though, is the only way of putting in a situation where you slice the system.
I wonder whether it's entirely true that we can't predict miracles. What I mean is that there are some social settings in which the opportunity for invention is fecund, and there are some that are not. And I'm wondering to what extent any people here know about attempts to model that and incorporate those conditions for technological fecundity into the model.
Can I respond to this particular line of questioning before John, and we maybe go a little bit different direction, I don't know. It is true that models like this are either incapable or very bad, depending on how generous you want to be, at forecasting discontinuous events. What they're better at doing is introducing discontinuous events and looking at some of the consequences. And again, that scenario tree that I was showing you allows the user of the model to posit something like a reversal of the Gulf Stream, assuming that you can translate that into some fairly reasonable consequences, such as changes in agricultural productivity or changes in energy demand that would result from that, and then play out some of the secondary and tertiary implications of that. That's a small step, perhaps, in the direction we want to go, but it's an important step in that direction.
Before we go on for the questions, maybe we should, is that Iqbal? Yeah. Okay, so we do have our final speaker of the day, so maybe let's go to our final speaker. Oh, I'm sorry, John. One last question. Better be a good question.
I'll try. Barry, there's always been a kind of, the world, there's two types of people in the world, and one of them, or two types of social scientists, and one group hate anything where, we want to see one equation or a system of equations that's at most three, where we can see it all. And then there's the global systems modelers and the econometric forecasters and the rest who, have giant things and then explain, you can't look inside here because you won't know what's going on, but you'll have to trust me that it's not just built into the structure, it's telling you something. And it's too hard to ask, sort of explain to me how any bit of this works. I understand cohort components and the rest. But when you write down for a policy scenario, if you could pull part of it out and say one of the things you had on a list there was one of the policy options was spend more on health care. Do you, just to give a flavor of it, what do you, if you, do you, what happens if you spend more on health care? What changes in the world when you spend more on healthcare? Do you know the production function that relates expenditures on healthcare to mortality or disease states or something else at the output end? And where, did that come from? Where did it come from? Where does that bit of it come from?
Okay. Darn good question. First of all, with respect to the two types of people in the world, I thought Paul Streeton said it pretty well. There are two types of people in the world, one who divides the world into two types of people and the other who doesn't. The answer to your question is the transparency and openness with respect to these models, which is the two issues that I'm focusing on increasingly heavily because of the complexity of this kind of modeling, is an ongoing challenge. You have to be able to explain how the government expenditures on health or on education translate into conventional power with respect to the military, translate into education spending, translate into other kinds of downstream consequences of that government spending. And what I've been trying to do is develop a set of tools in the model to allow you to go in, call up diagrams like this for a particular variable, like the one you just named, look at the equation representation in the model of government spending and its consequences and how it propagates through, or actually, if you want to, call up the computer code for those who are really interested in this, and in that particular area of the model, try to get more understanding. Now that's a step in the direction of the transparency and openness that I think these larger scale models need and have generally lacked. You sit down with them, you play with them, you get consequences, and you scratch your head and say, well, that maybe makes sense or maybe it doesn't, but why? You need to be able to look at the causal diagrams, at the equations, and at the code if you really want to get into that. And we're trying to make that accessible on every single variable in the model through the system that I'm just quickly showing you.
We may have some more questions for you, Barry, in a little bit, but let's go to our final speaker.
Do you need the? Sure. It's got the floppy in here. If you've got a. Do you have a CD? I can swap in a CD.
And while they're doing that, I'll try to do the introduction. And forgive me if I mangle your name, Iqbal Qadir. Iqbal comes to us from Kennedy School of Government over at Harvard, via Logan Airport in parts unknown, which is why he's zooming in the door. Iqbal is a fellow also at the Center for Business and Government and a visiting fellow at the Center for Business Innovation at Capgemini Ernst & Young. He founded Grameenphone, which provides telephone access throughout Bangladesh, including to its rural poor, by adding cellular telephony to village-based microenterprise. And I think that's the subject of the talk. In January 1999, the World Economic Forum, based in Davos, Switzerland, honored him as a global leader for tomorrow, which is comes back to one of the issues that we talked about earlier in the day, the type of individual that we truly need to bring about the types of transformations we'd like to see. Kadir worked as a vice president of Atrium Capital Corp and was an associate at Security Pacific Merchant Bank and Coopers Lybrand, and earlier worked as a consultant to the World Bank in Washington, D.C. So he's really got the kind of eclectic background, but applied to real-world action, which is the kind of thing that I think makes it most exciting for this talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. I'll start by just showing you this article I saw in September in Financial Times about how the several Arab countries are not have a poor governance problem. And I just want to highlight a particular line that this would be, I mean, these governments in the Arab countries wouldn't take it well because they thought they were good students of the multilateral institutions. So how come the model or advice followed by multilateral institutions are not producing the right type of results? And I'm trying to give you the context in which I think the project I'm describing should be viewed. And this is another book recently came out by Mr. William Easterly, who worked for the World Bank for 2 decades. And he points out in several ways that 6 or 7 ways the World Bank tried to address the poverty problems in developing countries, and he concluded that none of them really worked. And this is a book available right now. So I just want to say what's probably wrong with this? What's the other way to look at the solution? And I think you can see that the real problem might be that we look at problems in a top-down way. That is, we're trying to have a bird's eye view when you're dealing with lives of worms. As if the poor is a target, not a resource. As if wealth or better life is something to be provided to the poor. Overlooking how the economies of developed countries actually developed. Historically, they have developed in a bottom-up process. And overlooking the fact that engaging people in commercial activities is probably the key to getting these economies up. So again, the point is to see that the 2 billion people, you don't see them as mouths to feed, but how you can see their ears, how to put their ears and eyes to work, how to make their hands and legs to work. I think that's how we should see these, and that's the point I want to make through this presentation. And to show you another article that came out, I think, in last month in the Financial Times. I just wanted to show you this graph. This is the best thing I saw about Africa last 10 years. That you can see the fixed phones in the country, in the whole continent, has remained somewhat fixed. And the mobile phones are actually the ones that's moving. Something going on. I mean, here we have about 23 million phones all over Africa. And already in Africa, you have about 40 million, twice as many mobile phones. And they expect in next 3, 4, 5 years that to quadruple. And so you will have 100 million Africans suddenly empowered a little bit by something called cell phones. And that's something quite interesting because that's the kind of change that could probably contribute to anything upward that Africa could go. And same thing, by the way, is going on in Bangladesh right now, the country on which I want to tell my story. And in Bangladesh also, we already have twice as many cell phones as fixed phones. And again, this is something where you are empowering citizens. And that's why I was making the point that perhaps this could be this could contribute to a bottom-up process, whereas we have been focusing too much perhaps on a top-down development method. So the question is, how do we adopt the worm's eye view? And I learned a little bit about that from Grameen Bank, with which I worked. So back in '93, I was trying to be an investment banker in New York. And I was working in an office, and we had, that's not my picture, it's just the computer picture I got. We had 3 or 4 people connected by a computer network. This was an early form of networking, much rudimentary than what we have now. And it simply made our life a lot easier, because we didn't have to exchange floppy disks, so we could update each other and work together. And so it raised our productivity. But one day it broke down. So I was sitting idle for, waiting for someone to come and fix it. And while I was sitting there getting nothing done, I remembered a day in 1971 when the Bangladesh was going through a war, and there were lots of violence in the urban areas, and my family moved to a remote rural area. And one day my mother asked me to get some medicines for a sibling, and I walked all morning, like 10, 12 kilometers. And when I got there, the medicine man wasn't there. So I walked all afternoon back. So I remembered this unproductive day. Another one, perhaps for lack of communications. So I put the two experiences together, and I basically concluded that connectivity is productivity, whether it's in a modern office or in an underdeveloped village. So I started looking, where does Bangladesh stand in terms of telephones? And indeed, does it really lead to productivity? That was just my intuitive conclusion. So after lots of search for seeing some formal proof that connectivity leads to productivity or not, I found a graph produced by the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, which is the UN of telephones. And you can see, you put your country on the horizontal axis in this graph. So America would be way beyond the graph. So if you have a country that's a Bangladesh, $300 per capita GNP, you'd put it pretty near the vertical axis. And the vertical axis says contribution of one new telephone to the country's GNP. So if you see, if you're poorer the country, the higher the impact of a telephone, for instance. Perhaps because there's a lot more inefficiency to remove. But so let's say if you take Bangladesh as a country, let's say $300, the impact is perhaps $6,000 per year. So naturally the question was, how much does it cost to put in a telephone? And I found out it costs at most $2,000. So if you put in a machine that costs $2,000, and year after year, it produces $6,000, this is obviously a machine to have. And I also used the little economics I knew. Let's say Adam Smith said specialization leads to productivity. Well, how do you specialize? You can only specialize if you can depend on other people. So let's say I'm a fisherman and farmer, you're a fisherman and farmer. I will start fishing, you will start farming, only when we can depend on each other. And of course, we can do that if we are neighbors, for instance. Okay. But then we limit our economic sphere. So if you can connect to other people, depend on each other at a distance, then you can expand your economic sphere. So therefore, it's at least was obvious to me that connectivity leads to dependability. And that leads to specialization, and perhaps that's to productivity. So I was completely convinced that this is a machine to have. But of course, I did this searching because at the time, the major development institutions actually had a very small part of their portfolio in telecommunications. Actually, Asian Development Bank, I think, had almost none. And the World Bank had 1.5% of its loans. For whatever maybe the reason they have done that, that gave me the doubt that perhaps I'm doing the wrong thing. So I thought through this thing. So I'll show you another little graph, just completely from another place, just another recent article in The Economist on October 11th, just last month. See this graph, they show where the OECD countries, mature countries, where there's tremendous amount of connectivity already, okay? Where your household spending, and 10 years later, where those household spendings have gone. Food has gone down, restaurants have gone up, etc. Okay? One interesting thing is communications keeps going up. And these are countries where connectivity is already quite extremely high, number one. Number two, the cost of each connection is very much lower in these 10 years. Still, the total costs have gone up. That means it proves how important connections are. Because we're still trying to optimize, we're still trying to specialize, still trying to get more opportunities to ourselves. This is why the rich people of the world are continuously spending even more money on communications. But back in '93, Bangladesh, this is where it stood. 2 people per 1,000 people. Two phones per 1,000 people. So, and in the United States, for example, I think it's roughly at least 1,000 phones per 1,000 people. So, and virtually none in the rural areas where close to 100 million people lived. So those 2 phones for average over the whole country was actually serving just few urban pockets. And it cost $500. I was sitting in New York, it cost nothing. You just ask for a phone, people are happy to give you a phone. And $500, which is more than a per capita income of the country. So imagine, that's equivalent to almost $30,000, $35,000 here. And then you will have to wait for 5 to 10 years. So basically, this was a country I mean, you pay after you stop waiting. But still, basically, this is a country that didn't have telephones, certainly not in the rural areas. So let me bring you back to that graph. You see, it meant 2 things to me. First of all, if it really increases productivity, that means part of that productivity could be somehow channeled, if we can, to pay for the service. And number 2, therefore, this could be a business. Other is the ITU is made up of government-owned telephone companies. So they certainly knew this. At least they should. And still, we had this huge shortage of telephones. And in fact, there are other reports in ITU that showed that the number of telephones in the country were much smaller than the number of households who can afford the phone. Okay? So that means something is wrong, which is why they are not deploying more phones. So therefore, not only a business can be made because there's productivity that you could channel, but also it should be made. So I started looking, what are the myths? I mean, why don't we have more telephones? Is there some mental block that's blocking us? One of them is that poor people don't have the buying power. That's why they don't have telephones. Well, if it's a production tool, why do we care about buying power? I mean, if it should help people produce, then they get more money, then they pay for it. Like in the United States, people buy cars. Usually they don't pay for the whole thing. They put some money down, borrow money, and then the car takes them to work. The work pays them a salary. That gives them the ability to pay for the car. So if it's a production tool, then we should think about what it is really producing, than whether people can afford it or not at the moment. Second, so the question is actually really value. Are you getting more value? So people were, when I was saying that I should get this telephone to poor people in Bangladesh, then they said, oh, they won't be able to pay for it. But again, this is the point. Let me give you, to make the point, actually Harvard President Derek Bok was once asked, what do you think of, why is education so expensive at Harvard? And he apparently said, if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. Thing is, this is the same point. Ignorance is very costly. So if you cannot afford the telephone service, the no service is even more costly. Because people have to spend a day. Imagine when I spent a day and not getting anything done. If you just multiply that, let's say once a month one Bangladeshi is wasting a day like that. You multiply that by 130 million, and you will see lots of time wasted. And time is one thing the poor countries have equal to the rich countries. So if that's what we waste, it's even worse. So, so the other point is the initial buying power might be low. Well, in that case, what about shared access? In this country, people use banking service, but very few people use a bank all by himself. So it could be a community could use that service together. And I've been also told we have lots of primary needs that are unmet. We have to think about food, shelter, clothing, etc., before we think of something like telephones. So, and I kept saying, look, those the people who need the food and shelter, they will worry about those things. What we need to think about is how can we raise people's income. Then they can afford. When they can afford the food, shelter, they will decide how to allocate their income. So the issue really is not to be a big brother and deciding what we must get them, but how can we raise their income if we want to help them. So these are probably mental blocks that we can sort out in our brains. But the question is there some real practical problem that's preventing the emergence of more telephones, let's say? So I felt that the main practical problem is the lack of other infrastructures. For instance, internet was booming in this country because people already had computers, modems, software, credit cards, telephone lines, whatever. So when you have a new idea that requires all sorts of other things, and when those other things are there, something can spread very quickly. But even if you had a good idea, even if market made sense, and even if you had the right technology, still, if you don't have other things to piggyback on, then it's very hard to bring about something. And this naturally led me to see Grameen Bank, which of course was also trying to unleash a bottom-up economic development. So, so I started studying Grameen Bank. And among other things, they had 1,100 branches, 12,000 employees. So this could be a network. So for example, those branches could be places where I could put a cellular tower that could help bring about a cellular network. Or that we don't have an infrastructure of credit checks. Here, if you want a telephone, you just give your social security number, they quickly check if you have been paying your debt, and they give you a telephone right away. But that's not possible in a poor country. But in Grameen Bank had a pretty good record of getting its loans repaid. So I felt maybe they know who is a good credit. So all these things automatically made me think about Grameen Bank as a way to bring about, that would help me bring about a service. So I went to Grameen Bank and I said, look, would you like to be some kind of partner of this telephone project I'm thinking about? Or maybe they can be a client. Because I first told them, look, you have 1,100 branches, perhaps you can connect them with telephones and be modern and communicate and everything. And they said, no, they after all evolved in a country that didn't have telephones. So at least in the rural areas which they focused. And if you think, so they could not have evolved in being dependent on communications. So this, and I'm sure there are lots of other good reasons why they were a very decentralized banks. The branches managed more or less themselves. So if you go to Grameen Bank headquarters, it's relatively a quiet place. It doesn't look like it's managing 2.3 billion loans, okay? So they were not that interested in that. So I started thinking, what is it Grameen Bank that they do? And that's how I started learning the worm's eye view, so to speak. I learned that phrase from the founder of Grameen Bank. Now, this is what they really do. This is what I started focusing on. That a woman borrows money, $100, $200, and buys a cow. The cow gives milk. She sells the milk to the villagers and pays off the loan. This simple model seemed to be working out very well, and 95% or so people pay back. And once she has gotten a cow after 1 or 2 years, then she gets another cow or something else. So this system works very well. What they're really doing is promoting self-employment. So it's a cow for her, which is a business, but it's milk for the rest of the village. So I said, why can't a cell phone be a cow? Because somebody could get $200, get a phone, and pay for, have everybody else in the village pay for, use the service, and it'll be a little business for her. Okay. So business for somebody, phone for everybody else. So I went back to Grameen Bank and I said, look, I think a cell phone can be a cow. And they thought through this and they said, well, it's a little crazy but logical. But if you think it can be done, then come and do it. Okay. So I quit my job in New York and I went back and settled in Bangladesh. And first, before I went there, I created a company called Gonophone, which in Bengali means people's phone. And it's based in New York, funded by American angel investors from Concord, Boston, Fifth Avenue, etc. And they gave me some money to fly around and put together a consortium that would implement this idea. So of course I started convincing Grameen Bank in depth, and I went to lots of places, starting with American cellular companies. And eventually I convinced the Norwegian telephone company and Telenor. And so together, there are 4 companies. The Grameen Telecom is really Grameen Bank's sister organization, because Grameen Bank is meant to be just doing banking. And they created a new organization called Grameen Telecom, for lack of better names. Then these 4 organizations provided about $55 million as equity. And of course, Grameen Bank's name also helped getting a license from the government of Bangladesh. This required, by the way, I'm making the story very simple, but the process of assembling this consortium required from 93 to 99. Okay. But in late 96, exactly 7 years ago, we got the license from the government of Bangladesh. And we started building a network. And this is where actually the nature of the network is actually more dense than this. This is of 2002. There's more white spaces are covered by now. But I just didn't have a graph. And what I want to show is that it's much more extensive than previously what we had. We had pockets, some urban pockets like Dhaka and Chittagong had telephone services. But now you can go to many parts of the country where you can use a cell phone. And actually, these are GSM phones which roam around all the GSM services. Some American phones would also roam, but most European phones. If you are a Swedish subscriber, you could go to a village in Bangladesh and your phone would work. Your Swedish phone would work. So this is the summary right now. It's approaching 300 million investment. Actually, I think we have gone over 300 million in investment. 2002 net income after taxes was $44 million. It's now the largest telephone company in the country, about 1.1 million subscribers. Of that, about 37,000 phones, seems like a very small figure, are in the villages. That's the cow model, in 37,000 villages. But that represent actually more than 50 million people, okay? Because the whole country has about 68,000 villages. So it's more than half. And the country has about 130 million, 100 million or so in the rural areas. And the 37,000 village phones actually represents an equivalent of 400,000 urban phones, because each phone has a usage 10 to 12 times more. Because remember, one phone is serving 1,000 to 1,500 people in a village. So that's why its usage is actually much higher than in the urban phones. And each phone produces about $100. I think it might be a little bit lower now. So let's say $90 to the company, to Grameen Phone. Okay. But after all the costs, the village women who are retailing the services, they keep about $2 a day, which is about $700 a year, which is twice the per capita income in the country. And in the rural setting, that's actually pretty good income. And this is just a graph showing how the number of phones have increased over time. Again, these phones are generating profits for local entrepreneurs. Farmers can get market information, and sometimes the deals are made ahead of visiting a place. Let's say somebody is selling chicken in Dhaka, he would collect chicken from various villages and then sell them in Dhaka. But now he doesn't go to the village where there is nothing to buy from. So he sometimes makes the deals, ahead of visiting. It also, of course, improves welfare. People can call a doctor, or people can, urban overseas calls are actually the calling to urban centers, or literally New York, Dubai is quite common from the villages. Because somebody could be driving a taxi in New York, he could be calling his mother. But what I want to say is that the design makes a difference, and at the same time, the new technologies make new kinds of designs possible. So for instance, the prior perception is the poor is seen as a recipient. Well, the poor is a resource in this case. They are the ones who are involved in producing the service. It's too expensive to serve the poor. Well, their involvement at least reduces the cost. And also, we think we need to educate them and all sorts of things, but their involvement is also educating them. One of the interesting surprise I had is that it actually doesn't require very much time to train these women who have sometimes never seen a phone before, how long it takes to train them. It's usually 1 day, sometimes 2. Because poor people, when it gets to earning, because people can earn something from it, they are very keen to learn. And we, the rich people, have the luxury of not learning something. But they are quite keen to learn, and as a result, they learn quickly. So that's my conclusion.
After a lot of 20,000 feet talks today, it's nice to have somebody right on, feet on the ground. Questions? Yes.
Probably at the time you were planning this was before mesh networks and ad hoc networks became viable alternatives to cellular. I was wondering if you've gone back and looked at that issue for possible applications in other third world countries.
Yeah, well, it's just, yeah, that's true. But you see, there are lots of possibilities out there. And I am simply busy teaching right now. But also, I am involved a little bit in other projects. There's one small pilot project in Uganda in which I'm involved, where we are repeating the similar thing without creating a new telephone company, but simply in 100 villages or so, we're retailing the service and see if it works the same way. And it does, actually. Okay. And the other point I want to make, technology, of course, is unleashing lots of possibilities. Okay. But one way I see it, I was no technologist. Okay. One way I see it is that the real problem is not technology. In fact, the technology has become so good, you can start thinking that that's not an issue. The issue really is delivery. How do you deliver? Okay. How do you actually make sense to people? How can they actually advance their lives? Okay. So if you can think of a model that way, then I think there is a technological solution that will support your model. Okay. So I at least tend to see that way. So I'm not too focused on technology, frankly. Yeah. Yeah.
With the merger of internet and cellular phones, you've got obviously the capability of having websites for businesses, selling music, art, all the rest of that sort of stuff. Fabulous opportunities for individual businesses with a global market access. And are you going to go in the direction of upgrading the phones so that they're video and all that sort of stuff?
We already have that, actually. That's true. But again, you see, let's say Bangladesh, we're dealing with a country where maybe at most 40% of the people are literate. What I like about this thing, and I don't want to discourage the new possibilities, but the point is, telephone is ultimately very egalitarian. It's everybody can talk. And so no matter how sophisticated technology we may have, okay, it may have limited usage in places like this, okay? So yes, all those things are possible, and maybe someone in the village can make use of these things. But it's good to start this way, that's what I would say, okay? Because people can talk, and that's the basic technology we need.
Following up on Jerry's question, I'm wondering if your model is usable for a host of other tools that could be introduced to increase productivity. For example, introducing computers.
Well, you see, the model here is not very complicated. It's simply saying that a microcredit program can be a means to piggyback a communication program. And so if and this is especially interesting because in a poor country or in a poor region within a country, the regular telephone companies are reluctant to go. So and those are the places where microcredit organizations are also emerging. So this could be an effective solution for those kind of places. So that's exactly where you would likely to find a microcredit organization. So I think, yes, why not? In fact, I have been told by Grameen Bank that some borrowers are trying to borrow money to buy a computer. And Grameen Bank asked, what will you do with a computer? And some woman said, well, by the way, Grameen Bank, most borrowers are women. It's because over time they found that women manage money better. And so they have increasingly focused on lending to women. So what happened is that they found that this woman who wanted to buy a computer, because her daughter can apparently teach kids about computers, and those kids' parents are willing to pay something for it. So this would be another business model. And so I think anything is possible. And for example, we can have voice over IP, which can allow you to make telephone calls abroad very, very cheaply. So it's possible. Lot of places in Bangladesh, even rural places, which provides, let's say, all sorts of workers in the Middle East, in Singapore, in the United States, and people did not make calls because they thought they simply couldn't. But when the possibility is there, then people think about using it in all sorts of ways. And it's a little bit like, Federal Express or, before we had FedEx, nobody imagined that there would be a business that you would need for overnight shipping. But now we all wait until the last day, okay? People's work habits change, okay, when you have a possibility. So the point is, people are now communicating more. So because the reason I'm saying this is that when I started this, people said, have you done a market research? Okay, well, I would need some $150,000 to do a market research, which was sort of my total funding initially, okay? So I couldn't possibly do a market research, and what could the market research people do? There was no telephone in these areas, so how could they estimate whether there is a market or not? The point is, does it advance people's lives in a fundamental way? Okay, and I concluded this. I'll tell you a story just to make sense. I remember I was doing this going back and forth between Dhaka and New York, and one time I was going to the airport and my mother said, call me as soon as you get to New York. And I started thinking, why is she wondering about that? Because 20 years earlier, I came to America to study. And I wrote a letter once I got to my college, and she got that letter 3 weeks later, okay? So how come she put up with 3 weeks at that time and now refusing to put up a single day or so and asking me to call right away? It just occurred to me, why is she asking for that? And she certainly doesn't love me anymore. I have committed a lot more sins. But the point is, the issue was that it's possible. There's no other answer. So.
Saying that captures that. It's that invention is the mother of necessity. And once you've invented it, it becomes necessary.
Yeah.
I have a couple questions. First, in the 37,000 villages, where does electricity come from to power those phones?
Yeah,
we have. the second question, could you use this mechanism to funding like renewable energies, also like photovoltaic panels or things like this?
Yeah. We have, that would be, actually, the photovoltaic panels would make sense if the cost come down a little bit more. But we have about 20,000 villages in the country have electricity, or even a little bit less. So that's an ongoing problem. But we sometimes solve through photovoltaic cells, through solar panels, or sometimes car batteries. And so the good thing here is all the technologies are in the right direction. For example, batteries last longer, and solar panels are getting better or cheaper. So it's an ongoing problem. In fact, we have the same problem in supply in providing electricity to the network, because if we build up a cellular tower, that has to have electricity. And also in Bangladesh, not only electricity is unavailable, it's unreliable. And if it is, even if it is reliable and available, it can be unstable, okay? In the sense that the voltage fluctuates a lot more. So there are all sorts of additional costs we have to incur to manage this situation, but we are doing it.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think
It sort of, we started with the broadest and sort of have been going progressively to the more specific. If I could sort of ask you to draw some lesson back to the broad, do you think that the type of entrepreneurial thinking that drove sort of the story you told us and can only come from the market, or can it also come from the government? And what would it take?
Well, you can conclude yourself. You see, first of all, I was saying, let's say, for instance, right now, Bangladesh has close to 2 million telephones, okay? In fact, if you look at this thing, this is exactly what is happening. One second. This could be from Bangladesh, actually. It happens to be on Africa, okay? That usually the governments own telephone companies are fixed, literally, not just fixed phones, but also, and the mobile phones are taking off. And because usually, you see, in fact, it sounds like I'm critical of governments, but look at this. In fact, the mobile telephones would not have taken place if the government-owned telephone companies knew that this is the exact potential, okay? Their ignorance helped, frankly. And that is a very normal thing. You take it in this country, you have AT&T. That is the beauty of technology, because it surprises you. It finds a new way of emerging, and so that the vested interest cannot control it. Let's take this country. This is happening all the time, by the way. That take AT&T, which is a very powerful telephone company. By the way, AT&T, we know, was broken up by the US government in 1984. But actually, it was the microwave technology that started in the 50s that eventually evolved into MCI, which started challenging this situation, okay? That's what eventually got the government going and break up AT&T. So behind the government actions are often emergence from things from below, okay? But let's take even AT&T in the recent time. AT&T had all the resources in the world to think about where connectivity should be next. But how come we have AOL? Some things emerge from somewhere else to challenge the incumbent. The thing is, existing incumbents, it's nothing fault of the governments. It's simply this is a different mindset sets in, okay? And the technology allows you to create a new possibility and disperse power. That's how democracies can emerge, okay? So the government hold telephone companies. No matter how much see, this may be one of the errors we are making of thinking about development through governments. Because in my company, frankly, all the problems came from the government. I could have created, the company could have been even bigger, okay? And what we have done, if we look at history, the real thing that has happened, that you see, again, Europe developed over, let's say, last 500 years because there was technological empowerment from below who demanded things from the government. And that's where the compromises were made. So there was a devolution of authority that has given rise to better governance. What we have done, instead of having governments devolve, we put them in higher horses, instead of getting them from the high horses to lower horses. We put them on elephants. And as a result, the governments are often insensitive to what's happening on the ground. So, for example, let me show you. Let's take this one. These phones, do you know 1.1 million phones we're talking about? About 1 million phones, 95% of them do not connect to the fixed phones in Bangladesh. They're denied connection. Why? This makes the telephones crippled. It makes the phones, government loses revenues from it. And by the way, right now, this year, the government of Bangladesh is making about $150 million in terms of taxes, customs duties, all sorts of things from us, okay, in fees. But what I want to show you, so telephones, have you ever gone to get a telephone and said, I'll take a telephone, but this will not connect to a bunch of phones, or all the phones? In the beginning, that was the situation. You cannot sell a phone that way, because telephones by nature are supposed to connect to other phones. Okay? So the first phone in the world was useless. The second phone started to make the first phone useful, right? So if we started selling, after we had about 20, 30,000 phones, the government said, we're not going to expand the interconnection between your network and our network. I don't know what the reason was, but this certainly created the situation whereby we couldn't expand the network anymore, okay? And this was the plan B that has worked out, okay? The plan B, because I know the history of telecommunications everywhere in the developing countries is nothing but history of resistance to change, okay? So here, what we did here is that one of the reasons I see people ask me, are your village phones being subsidized by the urban phones? Actually, it's the opposite. The village phones are actually subsidizing the urban phones. I'll show you, among many ways, they will show you one way. We have covered the rural areas, so it has become a big network, okay? So as a result, see, because I know that if they disconnect us into their network, that would be our Achilles heel. Then we would be killed, literally, okay? So how can we survive that situation? So I started looking at what is their Achilles heel, the incumbent. Their Achilles heel is that they are, by design, a local telephone company. They provide services in Dhaka and Chittagong, two cities, okay? Because they were serving the urban elite, okay? And so therefore, they didn't have a long distance market. So therefore, the one way to overcome this problem and challenge them in a new market, which they don't address, is to provide a long distance market, okay? So when we could not connect to their existing phones, we started giving people two phones. Take one, take it to an employee. Take one, give it another one to your brother. And at least you can make a long distance calls over our network. That's how the number of phones grew. And eventually, whether we connect to the fixed phones or not has become somewhat irrelevant. But what I'm getting at, I know I can ask another question, but I think what I'm trying to tell you is that while we expect the government to help, okay, it has all sorts of reasons why it cannot. And in fact, it hurts often. They give us a permission expecting that perhaps we wouldn't be so big, okay? And that is what I'm getting at, is that in general, if throughout the African countries where the governments has enormous amount of power, very unlikely they would have given out these licenses to private sector, knowing that this would have such big potential. But please.
I'm not going to defend government. Certainly
no, I'm not trying to.
But my question
and
is,
I'm not attacking
right.
you. I'm just explaining why they have a problem.
Right. When I was growing up, parents, when they had a child, would apply for a phone so that by the time he or she graduates, has a phone. So I share that experience. But my question is that it's not as if the business sector companies are all rushing in to do this sort of development work. I mean, Grameenphone is an exception. So yes, governments have problems, but your model is so exciting because it is an exception. It's not as if Siemens and all the other private sector companies are doing all of this.
But you see, the solution is that you have to start, see, for example, now we have Wi-Fi technology, which can be started very small, okay? So somebody could spend $5,000, have a Wi-Fi hotspot in a village, okay? And literally, 5,000, it may be smaller than that. And could be literally more or less independent operation that would connect through the internet telephony, that village to the rest of the world. Even Grameenphone is a pretty large setup. Okay, so what I'm saying is technologies could emerge that would allow this grassroots kind of bottom-up development. Let's say, for example, take the gentleman was mentioning about the photovoltaic cells. Another thing that holds the poor country down is the national grid. Okay, it's very hard, for instance, to liberate yourself from that. Okay? Here we are waiting for when the grid will come to my village. What about thinking, how can we liberate ourselves from the grid? Okay, well, photovoltaic cell might do that. Okay, see, there are lots of political and economic vested interests. That's very hard to change. But technology can suddenly shift power. This is going on all the time. Women have a lot more freedom in this country, or in the rest of the world, because birth control pill was invented. Shifting power. Yeah.
I want to ask you, I'm curious at how this actually works. So you have one phone in a village of 100, couple thousand people maybe. So how does it actually work on a day-to-day basis? What happens, where does this phone travel in a day, and how do people...
It's usually the entrepreneur who is retailing the service is usually at the center of the village. That's one of the criteria they use to select the entrepreneur. Okay, and usually, maybe a call could be happening in her immediate neighborhood. About 70 people are regular users of the call. It's not all 1,500 people. But nonetheless, there is a contingent use. If anybody has an emergency or something, okay, maybe once in a blue moon, he or she might use the phone, okay? But about 70 people in a given village are sort of regular users, let's say once a week, okay? So these people, let's say a particular retailer is selling this, so she might walk around and take a phone if a call has come, or those people could come to her house. On the other hand, if it is far away, then, and again, Bangladesh is a pretty small country in terms of size, okay? So it's not a whole lot of walk maybe, but also people could make, oh, I'm gonna call my mother at 4 o'clock this afternoon. So maybe the woman goes to the mother ahead of time. So this is how it's not an ideal system by any means, but it seemed to work, okay? And there's an interesting thing I learned recently about one of the things that we did not really contemplate, but it so happens that it turned out to be a good thing. Because Grameen Bank, most borrowers are women, so these phone services are retailed by women. But had they had men borrowers, we would have gone that way, okay? But what we found is that it's usually men who are going to the urban places or to, let's say, even foreign countries. And so women, either their wives or mother or sister, tend to want to make the phone call, okay? So it is much easier for that woman to go to a woman entrepreneur than to a man's house, okay? So it has been a very good thing, because whereas a man would not be worried too much to go to a woman's house. I mean, it has unleashing in different social dynamics perhaps, that suddenly this woman who was supposedly poor has lots of power in the village, holding their communication center, okay? But be that as it may, you know, men are more not so shy to go to a woman's house perhaps, okay? But a woman would have been shy to go to a man's house. So this arrangement has actually worked out well, accidentally. We were not smart enough to see it. Yeah.
Fitting this into the other context of the conference is extremely important, not only obviously for Bangladesh, but for the whole world evolution, because neurophysiologists teach us that having the neural connectivity enhances brain functioning. So if you imagine a human being a neuron of the planet Earth, the faster you're successful, the faster the collectivity of the human evolution is.
No, connectivity is, I mean, the more I thought about it, you see, if I can make a similar point, when in my school days, I studied artificial intelligence a little bit. And I remember everybody was working on, that is the next front of computing, okay? But interestingly, it faced certain walls and didn't go much further than where it was, let's say in the late 80s or so. But notice that when connectivity emerged, the internet especially, suddenly the computing had a completely different way it emerged. Okay, so what I'm saying is that is the natural path whereby it could evolve into a much bigger thing. So instead of making one computer very, very powerful, which you had a kind of a block, okay, when it went in the communication direction, suddenly it became a lot more powerful. So this is a similar parallel point. Yeah.
Great. I'd like to see if we can open up the questioning in a broader sense. If you have further questions for Iqbal, that's great. But maybe any other questions for Barry or any of the other speakers that we've had today to try to sort of bring some conversation to some closure here, and before Cutler gives his closing remarks. Let me suggest with one point that again, coming back to Paul's initial slide that I keep talking about that so impacted me, this values, knowledge, power, culture, the ultimate drivers of transformations. I'm sort of seeing a lot of that kind of thing. It's not just technology we're seeing here. There are cultural dimensions, there are power structure dimensions, and what we're seeing is a sort of a great transformation in microcosm. We may not think it's a rural population in a distant country, but the essentials of great transformations are present in this example, and that's why I think it's such a wonderful illustration of what we've been talking about all day. But it's interesting that the government was largely bypassed in this situation. I can imagine that, not RAND, but the RAND Institute, the Ayn Rand folks, would look at this type of example and say, wow, this is exactly what Ayn Rand used to preach about in the 50s and 60s. But it's a great example.
My closing remarks.
Sorry. Questions for any of the speakers?
I wanted to get back to something Tariq said about that the planetary phase may have begun on September 11th, 2001. And I was curious, is Tariq still here? Yeah. Why you say that? I was sitting here thinking about January 1st, 2000, and that one of the reactions to September 11th in the rest of the world, I'm told, is that the rest of the world gave the U.S. a collective hug. And I was thinking about January 1st, 2000, when we, at least those that had television, watched the celebration of the new millennium as it went around the world, starting in the Meridian in the Pacific, and then, all these wonderful shots on television at least, people celebrating this collective event. And I thought of that as sort of when the world gave itself a collective hug. And maybe even that might be a more appropriate beginning of the transition to the planetary phase. We want to comment?
You shouldn't say sort of side remarks side remarks very seriously, But I should say that, there are things we'd like to see, because we'd like to see beginnings in good things, in things which sort of have a harbinger of the future. What I was trying to do was to quote from Ben Anderson to say that, a lot of the beginnings of collectivities, you actually trace them back to death, to martyrdom, to something which becomes such a rallying sort of cry for people as a marker of the beginning of a sensibility. And much that we would like to have markers which are, sort of happy periods of our life. Oftentimes, what pulls people together. I mean, like all my life I've been hearing, everybody who was alive on that day remembers when they heard that Kennedy was shot. I mean, it's, but a lot of the other happy events you probably don't remember in that way.
But there's another and easier answer. The millennium, in fact, began on January 1, 2001. Now,
September the 11th.
Actually, Cutler. Yeah, I just had a quick sort of comment, maybe asking David Ozanoff to make a comment. Thank you so much for your presentation, and I think that this example in Bangladesh it's an organic one, and it's exciting and I think very inspiring. One of the things that when I think about public health and sort of global issues in public health, has to do with communication about very basic information. I mean, not, expensive or really sophisticated solutions, but getting some very basic information disseminated to the right people, perhaps in the right time in the right way. And David, I was just wondering, I started thinking about this gramophone model and wondering if there might be some implications for disseminating very simple information regarding public health. For example, could an experiment be done in Bangladesh with recordings on basic health information to sort of see if, without getting into whether these are handheld computers or are they literate or not literate, as you say, they're designed to be used to talk and to listen. So David, it occurred to me that there might be some very exciting implications for public health, but...
David, before I give you the mic, it's very difficult to pry this from my hand, I'm sorry, it's pathological. But, no, but it might be dangerous because I'm going to ask you a follow-up question on that, both you and John, because Iqbal wasn't here, so I would have also asked him. But as we start thinking of our concluding chapters in the papers that you will all give us, could you and John think of the example that we just heard and see if there are any parallels to the type of transitions that you were talking about? We've been relating things to Paul's model throughout these various talks, but are there any parallels between these global things that you were talking about or national things that you were talking and this local example that he's been talking about?
Can I just suggest one? Grameen Bank, when you join, there are 10 principles, one of which is to plan your family sensibly, and the Grameen Bank is one of the leading, it was one of the big ways that the messages got out about family planning in rural Bangladesh. At the time of the millennium, it was said that more than half of the people in the world had never made a phone call. And in fact, at that time, more than half of the people in developing countries old enough were using modern contraception. So modern contraception, probably shouldn't use the word market penetration, but it was a lot better than that of phones well in advance. That in many ways it is one of the earliest technologies that spread, and phones are catching up now.
As I'm still pondering market penetration, as my daughter would say, bad visual. One of the things that I'm impressed by, actually, and when it comes to public health communication and education, is how little educators know about public health. And I think one of the things that is interesting about the spread of communications and decentralized communications through the internet is how much health educators are learning from people out there rather than it going the other way around. Now, there's a lot of information out there floating around the net, some of which is okay and lots of which is, probably not okay. It's pretty hard to tell the good stuff from the bad stuff. But one thing has been fairly clear, that those of us who used to think we knew how to do things in public health are finding out that we don't really know how to do it. And that Dick Clapp once used a phrase many years ago that I just really find useful, that out there in the community, however you want to define that, there's an incredible amount of raw brain power. And if one thing that these decentralized communication technologies are allowing is for us to be able to tap into that in some respect. So I know you did ask me about, how can we get good public health information out there? I've been so much more impressed over the last 5 or 10 years of how much really good public health information has come back to us from out there rather than the other way around.
One more question / comment before.
I have one question. I would like the speakers to address the speed of the change, the pace of the change of the great transformation. We've talked about like the graphene phone, it took 10 years to happen. We were talking about the energy before. We're talking about like how fast can you put the spider webs in the space. Well, the energy system is like $10 trillion worth, and there's 400 billion investment a year. So how fast can you do that? So one of the topics I haven't seen addressed is how fast can the great transformation happen without being traumatic.
That's for you. Paul, that's up your alley, pal.
I need 2 mics for this. Well, just try to connect a few things up. I think one thing we learned from these stories is that the solutions are scale dependent. So when we talk about the evolution of a global system or a planetary transition, we're really talking about a system that's like a set of Russian Matryoshka dolls where one's inside another. So that our village entrepreneur is also part of a country, is part of a river basin, and whether they like it or not is becoming part of global citizen. So the pace of change and the kind of solutions, there's no simple answer. This is a complex, multi-level system that's evolving here that will happen with a different metabolism at different scales. And our job is really to see the connections between these different scales so that the kinds of energy that's released from below, from the worm, is also informing what's happening at the level of the bird, and that subsidiarity principle is applied well in a mutually reinforcing way. But if you ask me the question in terms of the whole system, I think we have several decades to try to get on the right track, and it will never really be completed. But the question is, can we start it? And while the change can come in the matter of 8 years at the village level, as we start evolving these new kinds of ways, new kinds of forms of coherence and energy at the global level and all the way on down, I think we have a window of opportunity here of several decades.
David.
In Europe, in the 1300s and 1400s and 1500s, people were living through a distinctive transformation, the Renaissance. But people who lived then didn't know that they were alive during the Renaissance. Nobody knew there had been a Renaissance until the 19th century, when the historian Karl Burkhardt, looking back, said they were having a Renaissance. So for all we know, in answer to the question, for all we know, we're already living through one of these great transformations.
Over here, and then Tariq, and then we have to stop, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that last comment and underline it about 20,000 times. There's some witnesses in this room that knows that 20 years ago I was bending arms to try to beat the monopolies of cable and wireless, why those problems were going on, and it was like public enemy number one around the world. Now, it's like you don't have an internet address, you don't have your own web. That was 20 years. If I had said this 20 years ago, that 100,000 people, 100 million people would search 100 million computers in less than a second at no cost, you would say you're hopelessly, futuristically, idealistically wrong. So yeah, I think the point that we're probably in it, you write 2 scenarios. One, imagine we're probably in it, and how would we change our decisions over the next 10 years compared to, well, it'll be in 30 years. It might change our decision making. The idea that Google, that you can say, I don't know something, and go to Google and gets an answer relatively quickly. The idea that I don't know something is a dysfunctional phrase now. But if I said 20 years ago, the idea of not knowing something is an unacceptable statement, you'd say, grow up, kid. There's certain things you don't know. But Google has gotten rid of that concept. Now, that's an amazing thing for university, because you went to a university to get knowledge. Now you can go to Google and get knowledge, you know?
Well,
I mean, that's not, you know, I realize that's a bad comment. But the point is that I think that if you take a look at some of the harbingers of a transition, I think that would be a very interesting exercise to give little data points that, yeah, maybe we are already in that transition now. I think that your point about the Millennium celebration, I think, would be one of those. Because I remember, along with, I think, everybody in the room, there's a lot of people that says there is going to be fights, there are going to be some bombs, there are going to be all kinds of stuff, not to mention the Y2K. But in fact, what happened was it was the greatest peaceful expression of the collective human that had ever happened before, and it was the first one, and it was peaceful. That may be another one of these little harbingers along. So I would like to underscore that a lot. What if we actually were in it? Would we think differently? Would we act differently than if we thought it was going to happen at a particular time 30 years from now?
Thank you. Tariq?
Just a quick point on the discussion that took place a little earlier. From my perspective, and you know, having looked at Iqbal's work and Grameen and so on, one thing which I have taken away is that it is not so much the technology which actually creates an enabling condition, but it is actually the social technology. You know, the people who actually bring in, you know, I mean, in some sense, what they have done is not the fact that they've sort of, you know, it's this mobile phone, but it's the social technology that you've put in place, which is quite unique. And everywhere you go, you actually find this thing, that it is the most critical is the social technology business. But on this point, I must say that you know, on one point, I disagreed with you, Iqbal, and agreed with Adil, which is not a surprise considering that we have done so much work together. But I have found examples of this kind of social entrepreneurship in all sectors, you know, including business, including government. It really requires a particular sensibility. What I find is that the people who are prone to this oftentimes gravitate towards quote-unquote civil society organizations. You know, you might be an academic or a businessman, but you go to Grameen Bank. You know, some bureaucrat in Pakistan might be a bureaucrat, but you know, they sort of start associating with sort of the NGO types and so on and so forth. But they've done a lot of these things, including in the mobile phone business. I mean, the government of Pakistan and the Pakistani government-owned whatever company has actually done the most. You know, it's just tremendously changed and transformed that situation. So I should not sort of, you know, rule that out. You know, you might have particularly bad bureaucrats in some place and particularly good ones, but the entrepreneurship is the issue that one needs to look at. Yeah.
We certainly have good bureaucrats because that's how we got the license in the first place, okay? But the point is, we should not be, see, if, let's say I'm a citizen, and my government is somewhere, I should contribute in making my government better. Because the government is the hub through which a collective decision is made, okay? But so what I'm saying is that that's how I see it. If we expect something from the government, okay, then a lot of things didn't happen. Telecommunication is just one example. I can go to power, anything else. Let's say Bangladesh has this garment industry, which is apparel manufacturing, and basically getting fabric from other countries, and people are sewing it up and selling it abroad. This has been an important breakthrough in the country, and this has happened despite the government, okay? And yes, they have given certain permissions, but that's how the entrepreneurs asked for it, you see? The point is that, so it's a, yeah. Yeah, okay, sure.
That's what receptions are for. Well, I'm not going to try and say anything profound because it'll just end up sounding the opposite of that. But I will thank everyone for coming. I know a number of you have come a long ways and have juggled schedules, and we really appreciate the effort. It's been a very engaging, thought-provoking day for me. I can tell you that we are going to collect the papers and the presentations that were made in the electronic form and have them made available at the website eventually. And so I'll keep all the participants informed of that, as well as the progress on the book that will come out of that. And I thank all of you for coming. We do have a reception outside, which is ready to go, and everyone here is invited to that. And I hope we can continue some of these conversations there. Thanks again to the folks who helped organize this, Adil, for helping me put this together, David and his insights in getting things organized, all of our students who are the driving force behind a lot of this. Of course, Fred, again, we're thrilled that you were here, and your support has made all this possible, and especially at the top of the food chain, Maddie Goodwin, who did all the work of getting this together, and I think we all owe her a big round of applause, and thank her for her work.